All right, today is Wednesday, I believe, December 6th. It's 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern time. And we're going to be studying classical arithmetic at this time. Eventually, we're going to get into classical music a little bit. But today, we're going to continue what's really an introduction to the study of arithmetic, classical arithmetic. We're going to be reading chapter 2 of Nicomachus's Introduction to Arithmetic, which is pretty easy to understand, but very important because whereas in the first chapter, he introduces us to the study of philosophy in general. In chapter 2, he actually begins to zero in on arithmetic in particular. So we're going to learn what classical arithmetic is about in this lesson and talk about that a little bit and make sure that's clear. Because modern arithmetic, modern arithmetic and classical arithmetic are two very different things. They're both important. Some would have us choose one or the other, but that's really not realistic. We can't choose one or the other. We've got to do both, at least to some degree. But classical arithmetic is concerned with the development of our mind and the pursuit of wisdom, whereas modern arithmetic is concerned with practical things. And like I said, they're important in our lives because we have to do practical things, and mathematics is central to that. The problem is in modern schools, often practical arithmetic is allowed to take over the curriculum. And so we have students who are spending hours and hours every day studying arithmetic and algebra, even higher math and algebra like calculus and trigonometry. And yet those kids have never studied scriptures. They've never studied moral philosophy. There are very, very important subjects that they've never even started, as they spend hours and hours and hours trying to advance in practical mathematics. And it doesn't make any sense because when you're 18, 19 years old, and if you choose to go to college, you can take practical math classes in college. So it really doesn't make much sense to be 18 years old and have spent years and years on practical math studies. And during those years of your teenage development, never having studied any religion or moral philosophy. That doesn't make any sense. When you're 18 years old, usually that's the age we recognize that students become legally independent, and you're free to start making the most important decisions in your life. And if your head's filled with algebra and calculus and not with religion and morals, you're going to make bad decisions. And we see that most college-age kids do make lots and lots of bad decisions, and that's part of the reason why. So when you go to college, if you decide you want to be an engineer, you want to be who knows, whatever, a scientist, you want to major in business or something like that, you can take college classes where you can have great instruction in arithmetic and learn practical mathematics. So it's not something you have to really master when you're 16 and 17 years old. I usually tell my kids not to worry too much about mathematics. For that reason, once they go to college, they can take, I mean, you can take algebra in college. You can take calculus and trigonometry and all that stuff. And I would rather have them do that in college, because when they're with me at home, I would rather have them study religion and philosophy. And if they choose to not study business or engineering, they're not going to need very much math, and they can just take whatever they need and get it done during their first year or so of college. So math is really not a big deal. You have to make sure you get through the diploma requirements, study algebra 1 and 2, study geometry, and that's really all there is for high school mathematics. Most students who go beyond that are wasting a lot of time, unless you're really serious about a career that depends on mathematics. So what I'd like to help you focus on is learning some of this classical mathematics, which gets into philosophy. The benefit of this for you, the benefit of this study of classical mathematics is not that this mathematics is going to help you with practical things, but it's going to help you learn to be a human being and think as a human being, to use reason, to think of things that are not material, to not be materialistic. And that's an important step in developing, especially as you get into adulthood. So you're not just this materialistic animal that can't think of anything but material things. You've got to cultivate your humanity, and that takes work. So we're going to get into chapter 2 today, and you'll see how we move from Nicomachus's introduction to philosophy in chapter 1 to mathematics in chapter 2. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll just jump right into this today. George, I will not be using my Blackboard. That's from a class I taught last night to adults on reasoning. I have adult classes in the evenings at 9 o'clock Eastern time, and that's for a reasoning class. All right, chapter 2 of Nicomachus's Arithmetic. In chapter 1, just to review, I don't know if you all were here last week, but in chapter 1, Nicomachus explained that in the ancient world, people used to use the term wise for anyone who had any skill. So, for example, if you went down into town and in the middle of town, there was a guy juggling swords, riding a unicycle, that would be an example of wisdom. You would say, oh, wow, look at this wisdom. Any kind of skill was considered wisdom. If a carpenter was good at his work, that was called wisdom. If a person was good at playing the piano, that would be called wisdom. But when Pythagoras came around 500 BC, Pythagoras corrected everyone and said, this is not wisdom. Wisdom is not carpentry work. Wisdom is not playing a musical instrument. Wisdom is not juggling swords. These are just activities that are physical, and they're practical. This is not what wisdom is. Wisdom is intellectual. Wisdom is not some practical skill. So Pythagoras corrected really the whole world by teaching what wisdom is. And he explained that wisdom is the knowledge of truth of real things. Wisdom is the knowledge of the truth in real things. That's what wisdom really is. And real things are things that are permanent. Real things are things that do not come and go. Real things are things that don't change. And a wise man doesn't pay. I mean, think about it. If you study Theophrastus's characters, you learn about the newsmonger and some of these other characters. A person who's a gossip is constantly learning about what's going on in the news, constantly talking about everybody's business and so on. The mind of a gossip is on all kinds of topics that are constantly changing. The news is new every single day. There's new headlines, new stories, new gossip stories, new rumors. That's what foolish people spend their time thinking and talking about. 90% of it turns out to not even be true, and it's all a giant waste of time. Most people today are on social media, reading the news, following every story that comes up. And like I said, most of it turns out to not even be true, and they just exhaust themselves constantly trying to chase down the next story or the next rumor, and they never make any intellectual progress. That gossipy spirit is the normal spirit for fallen human beings. They like to live in that world of gossip and change and constantly busying about and doing things that really don't matter. Things that just are common and materialistic and simple. It's a very lazy life intellectually to live like that. And that's why people like it. When you get into real studies, it's mentally difficult and people don't like it, so they won't do it. And that's the difference between educated people, which make up a small number of people in the world, truly educated people, and the common people who really live by gossip and rumor and what they can observe with their senses and so on. So Pythagoras explained that wisdom is the knowledge of truth in real things. And the idea of reality is the opposite of what everyone else thinks reality is. People in secular society will say things like seeing is believing. Like, I'm not going to believe it until I can put my hands on it. Think about St. Thomas in the gospel, right? He's not going to believe that Christ rose from the dead until he can see his wounds and, touch his side. He's not going to believe. Well, that's a foolish spirit. That's not a wise spirit. Fortunately, Jesus is merciful, and so he bears with people like Thomas. He allows Thomas to see him. He allows Thomas to touch him, because God's merciful. But notice what Jesus says to the disciples is, you are blessed because you've been able to see these things which men have desired to see. But he says, rather, those who are blessed who do not see and believe. Those are the truly blessed people who don't need to see to believe, but who can reason and who can believe because they understand the truth, not because they've actually seen it or touched it. Another good example in the gospel is there's a Roman military leader. He's called a centurion because that's a position in the Roman military. He sends his servants to Jesus. I think there's even one account where he may come to Jesus himself. But Jesus says, okay, you've got a servant who's sick. All right, I'll come see him. I'll come visit. And the Roman says to Jesus, I don't need you to visit. I believe in you. I know who you are. All you need to do is say the word, and my servant shall be healed. And that became a part of the Mass. That statement, we say that before we receive the Eucharist. You see, and Jesus says to that centurion, or he says to his disciples, he says, I have not found faith like this anywhere in Israel. Right? That's what faith is. It's that ability to understand and believe, not to have to see it, not to have to touch it or feel it or experience it, but simply to know the truth, understand the truth, and believe it. The centurion had that kind of faith, which is wisdom. Wisdom is understanding real things, and certainly Christ himself is the most real thing. So that's what philosophy and wisdom is, the understanding of true things. But Pythagoras is talking about a lot more than just God, right? We can't oversimplify this. He's talking about ideas that exist in our minds, that we should be thinking about, we should be studying, we should be talking about, things that don't change. And we talked in our first meeting last week, we talked about the things that he's talking about are abstract ideas. That's really what he means by real things, abstract ideas. So for example, when you go to Mass, you may be preparing to receive communion and you don't really know what you should be thinking about. You see the priest and he's going through the liturgy, and there you are sitting there or standing there or kneeling there, and you may wonder, what am I supposed to be thinking about? What am I supposed to be doing here, right? And you may watch the priest and you see he's consecrating the bread and the wine. Okay, I see the bread, I see the wine, but that's not what religion is about, right? It's not about bread and wine. It's not about physical things. What am I supposed to be thinking about here? And what Pythagoras would tell you is you're supposed to be looking at the things that are going on in the Mass. You're supposed to be looking at the priest, looking at the paintings, looking at the statues, looking at the bread, looking at the wine. But you're supposed to be drawing ideas away from that, and that's what you're supposed to be thinking about. That's what contemplation is. So, for example, if the priest in consecrating the bread holds up the bread in front of your eyes and says, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me," what you should be thinking about is not bread, right? Because that's a material thing that changes. Even, you're going to consume that bread and it's going to be digested and disappear. It's not real. So you can see the appearances of the communion, the bread and the wine, they're temporary. That's not the real thing. The real thing is what's behind the bread and the wine, the substance of Christ. That's the real thing. And so St. Thomas, there's a prayer I don't know if you guys have this missal or if you guys have a missal, but in this missal, in the back of the missals, there are prayers before and after Mass to get ready for Mass and then to give thanks after Mass. And they're written by St. Thomas Aquinas. And before Mass, he says, I receive this sacrament behind a veil. It's hidden behind a veil. The veil is the bread and the wine. And so you can see that St. Thomas understands that the reality that we're supposed to be thinking on is invisible. It's not the bread and the wine. It's the substance of Christ himself who's present behind the veil. of the bread and the wine. That's what we're supposed to be thinking about. We're supposed to be thinking about these invisible, unchanging realities that exist behind visible things, behind the physical things. So, for example, during Mass, as you're there at Mass, watching the priest go through the consecration, and you're participating, you could think about the concept of love. You can think about love, and you can use a meditation on communion and on Christ's sacrifice for us to ask the question, what is love? And you can meditate on Christ's love, and you can understand what love is. Love is to take upon yourself the problems of other people, to sacrifice yourself to help others, to be patient and tolerant with other people, to be faithful to people always, even when they have problems, even when they have troubles. And you can meditate on the concept of love itself through the Eucharist. And that concept of love is what Pythagoras would call a real thing. That's a thing that idea in your mind is a thing that's never going to disappear. It's never going to change. Love is what it is by definition. And by focusing your mind on that unchanging concept, you'll feel in your soul, you'll feel peace, you'll feel a sense of order and simple focus. There won't be any chaos, there won't be any anxiety, no confusion, no stress. That's the benefit of contemplation. Focusing your mind, focusing your soul on things that are calm, on things that are stable, on things that are not changing, and so on. And that's what it means to become a wise man or a wise woman. It's contemplating, focusing on things that never change, not paying attention to the priest. You'll hear people criticizing the church. They'll say, oh, this priest is goofy, he's silly, he's overweight. No, they'll criticize priests. They'll say the music is terrible, the church is ugly. When you hear people talking about those things, those are people who don't understand what religion is. Their minds are not even on the things you're supposed to be focused on. For a person who's wise, it doesn't even matter what the priest is like or what he's doing or what the music sounds like. It doesn't even matter, because that's not the object of the attention of the Christian person. So when people complain about the church, notice what they're complaining about. They're complaining about all the changing things. They're complaining about all the visible and audible things. Those are the things we're not even supposed to be focused on. We're supposed to be focused on the invisible things. So that's a test of our own character, right? Foolish people will be distracted by distracting things. Wise people, those things won't even affect them. It doesn't matter. They're not important. So that's what Pythagoras means by a wise man. And to study philosophy means to become people who focus on the invisible things, who focus on the unchanging things, and aren't distracted by all of the changing nonsense of the material world. So that's what he talks about in chapter 1. And now we're going to pick up here and get started with chapter 2. So we're going to read chapter 2 here. Let's just see here. George says he doesn't have a life himself. I'm hoping you're talking about Christ there, what I was talking about. I'm not sure. We should focus on the God-given power the priest has and not the actual priest. Yeah. We should focus on the things that don't change. So if that priest dies, for example, and he's replaced with another priest, the Catholic faith doesn't change. The priest, it's not dependent on the priest. It's not dependent on the building we're in. We may have to move to another place at some time in our life. The whole building is different. Everything's different. But actually, everything is exactly the same if you're actually a Catholic who's focused on the right thing. So we've got to learn to become that person. And most people don't, as you can tell by all the complaining among Catholics. All right, so let's look at chapter 2 here. And that's a general introduction to philosophy and what it means to be wise and things like that, how to have a peaceful life. You don't have to have, in order to have a peaceful, happy life, you don't have to have success in everything you do. You don't have to have good health. You don't have to have a beautiful spouse. You don't have to have all of these wonderful material things. You can have a happy, peaceful life in any circumstances if you learn how to live and what to focus on, and you discipline yourself to do that. That's why you can see someone like Mother Teresa living in the poorest, most terrible circumstances in the whole world, and yet having a quiet, peaceful, happy life, going around teaching other people how to be happy while she lives in the worst conditions in the whole world. You can look at St. Francis, who is walking around barefoot with hardly any clothes on and is rebuilding a fallen church with no money or resources. He's got crippled people helping him to rebuild the church that he built. And he's as happy as can be because he's thinking about the right things, and all of the changing circumstances of life, they're not even what he pays attention to. When you look at people, when you think about how other people talk about people, they talk about how they look, they talk about their hair, they talk about their clothes, their skin, their eyes. When you hear people talk like that, you can tell that they're not wise people. When we're taught to go love our neighbor as ourselves, it's assumed that when we look at another person, we really don't pay attention to the outward appearance, but we pay attention to what they actually are. We meditate on their actual substance as a human being, created body and soul in God's image. And then we treat them as a person who's defined like that deserves to be treated. That's what it means to live like a Christian. And so you've got to become philosophical in order to live the Christian life, because the Christian life is a life that only makes sense if you're philosophical. If you're still focused on external things all the time, you're not going to be able to do it. You're going to be frustrated all the time. You're going to be confused. Things are going to be constantly changing in your life, and you're going to feel like you got the rug pulled out from under you. That's the source of chaos and confusion. And then people use that as an excuse to sin. They say, oh, well, this happened and this happened. So, so I took it upon myself to do this and do this. And they start sinning, and they use their changing circumstances to justify sinning. And it's just an excuse. So we've got to learn to focus on the real things. And for this class, we're going to focus on mathematics, because mathematics, when it's rightly understood, mathematics is a real thing. Okay. It's not the ultimate real thing. So we're not supposed to spend our whole life focused on mathematics, even true mathematics. This is a study that helps us begin to think about real things. But then there are higher and more important things that we need to move on to. But mathematics in philosophy was intended to help students get started thinking about real things, because it's easy for us to get started thinking about mathematical things, as we'll see. So chapter 2, let's read chapter 2 together. I think it's pretty simple, this chapter, but I want to make sure you pay attention to the real things and understand what it's talking about, okay? So Nicomachus writes and says, those things that are real, those real things, they are immaterial. So they're not made out of wood and stone and brick or earth. They're not material. And if they're not material, that means they're also invisible. You can't smell them. You can't touch them. You can't taste them. They have no matter. They're not material. They're eternal. They have no beginning or end. They last forever. So obviously, I have a beginning and I don't have an end, but I have a beginning. I'm not one of those eternal things. I have a beginning. I was made. My body, it has an end. My soul doesn't have an end, but my body does. And then we believe in the resurrection. But if you're looking at my body, you're looking at a part of me that's not even really me. And that's the deceitfulness of our senses. If you look at my body and say, look at this goofy guy, you're not even really thinking about me as who I actually am, the real me. The real me is my essence. When my body dies, the real me is going to remain alive. And when I'm resurrected, the real me is still going to be there. It's going to be the same person still there with a new body. So, learning to think about people according to this reality, the real me has no end. The real me is not my body, which had a beginning and will have an end. The real me has no end. And when you wonder like, well, how are we going to use this in life? Well, I can tell you, last week, my mother was in the hospital. She had a stroke. She went into the hospital. We had no idea what was going to happen. Turns out she's okay. But we went into the hospital. If you think that this kind of stuff is not important, I would like to see you visit someone who's dying in the hospital and see what you have to say to that person. That person wants to be surrounded by philosophers in the hospital. That person wants to be talked to about eternal life. They want to talk about how the body is just temporary, that you're not actually going to die. Your body is going to die, but your soul is going to continue to live. That's what a person who's dying wants to think about and know. As a philosophical person, I can have a nice, happy, peaceful conversation with my mother while she's laying in the hospital bed and she might be dying. Everything can be peaceful. The conversation can be happy because I know, and she also knows because she's a Catholic, she knows that she's not about to die. It's not time to panic and go crazy. Her body might be dying, but she's not going to die. And so she can rest and be happy even while she's in the hospital, and we can have a nice conversation. So if you don't think these things are practical, maybe when you're a teenager and you're not surrounded with people dying, you may think that this is not very important. But when you get older and your friends start to die and your relatives start to die, if you're not able to think like this, you're going to have a miserable time because all of the things that you think are real are going to start to disappear. And really, nothing's changing. So becoming philosophical allows us to be happy and to have peace even when we go through difficult times, because we focus on the important things and we don't allow the other things to distract us. So real things have no end. It is their nature to persist ever the same and unchanging. They don't change, abiding by their own essential being. They stay exactly what they are. And if there are things that change, if there are things that change, we know that those are not the real things. So if I look at you and I watch you and I, like, for example, I see Josh and Joy in the video, I'll see you. I've seen you over the past few years, and I can watch you over the next few years. There's going to be all kinds of things about you that change. Your hair is going to change. You're going to get taller. You're going to grow older. But those are not real things. And, I'm not going to pay attention to those things. I'm not concerned about your hair. I'm not concerned about how tall you are. All the kind of stuff that moms like to talk about usually. I'm concerned about you for what you actually are. I'm concerned about your actual life. I'm concerned about moral decisions you make. I'm concerned about what you're thinking about, what you're studying, and so on. That's what I'm concerned about. I don't care if you're 14 years old or 24 years old. That's all irrelevant. I'm concerned about you, what you really are, and what your life is really doing. So you can see how it just changes relationships and it makes you focus on things that are actually real and not things that are constantly changing. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Our bodies can be sick. Everything stays the same. That we see that in the lives of the saints. How many of the saints were sick their whole lives? Many of the saints spent most of their holy life sick or having some kinds of problems physically. And it teaches us that God really doesn't make our physical life the important thing, even for saints. God often takes that away to force people to become more philosophical, more spiritually minded, and so on. And so that's a help to the saints. So things that are abiding by their own essential being, their essence, what they really are. And each one of them is called real in the proper sense. That's what it means to be real. The real Josh Pelletier, the real Lara Varela, the real who you are, the real William Michael is not going to change. It's the same today. It's the same when I was 17 years old. It's the same when I'm 48. It's going to be the same when I'm 80. It's the real me is not changing. That's my essence. That's what I actually am. That's real in the proper sense. But those things that are involved in birth and destruction, those things that are involved in birth and destruction, growth and diminution. Diminution means getting smaller. So for example, you see a child, and you say the child is growing. That's not really true. The child's not really growing. The child's body is growing. And then you see an old woman, and she's near the end of her life, and her body starts to get smaller as she gets old. That woman's not getting smaller. Her body's getting smaller. That which is involved in birth and destruction, growth and diminution, her body, all kinds of change and participation, the things that are seen to vary continually. And while they may be called real things by the same term as the former, so some people may refer to that as real things because they partake in real things, which are the qualities behind the body or in the body. They are not actually real by their own nature, because they do not abide for even the shortest moment in the same condition, but are always passing over in all sorts of changes. So just this simple concept, if something is changing all the time, well, George, that's a good question. What's actually happening there, George, is when a person if we say someone is growing mentally or growing spiritually, what they're actually doing is becoming perfect. That's what they're actually doing. So, for example, when a child is born, a child is fully human, but the human potential of that person is not yet perfect, right? And so as the child grows, he becomes more and more perfect. And what perfect means is complete. He becomes more and more complete. I would argue that this is the argument against abortion, because I think the arguments Catholics make against abortion, I think the arguments are actually very weak. And I think that's why most people don't agree with Catholics on abortion. Because the question is, when does a person become a person? And what they're really saying is, when does reality happen for a person? And we say, oh, well, when the child is born, that's when he becomes a real person. And then Catholics say, no, life begins at conception. He becomes a real person as soon as conception happens. Well, you can see that there's no way for us to prove that to a bunch of materialistic people who want physical proof. And that's why the arguments don't work. I would argue, and I think the philosophers would argue, that at the moment of conception, what you have is a potential human created. And the perfection of that human is present in that potential human. And so that potential human is infinitely valuable, because everything that you need for a perfect human is present in that little embryo that's starting to grow in the mother's womb. That's the argument that should be made. We value things for their potential. For example, gold can be turned into beautiful jewelry. But, when we find gold in the earth, it's not jewelry. It's just raw gold. Sometimes it's mixed with other junk, and it's got to be purified. But nobody takes a piece of raw gold or gold ore that's found in the earth and says, oh, look at this. That's not a necklace. And they throw it in the garbage. Nobody does that. They recognize that the gold is valuable because of its potential. And they recognize that potential. And so they value it. And so if somebody finds gold, even though that gold is impure, even though that gold can't be used for anything in its current form, they celebrate because they have something that in it, there is a potential value. And it's for the gold, for the person who purifies the gold and for the person who makes the jewelry, they bring that to perfection. But we celebrate the value of the thing in its potential. And yet when we come to human beings, we have a society that does the opposite. They take a human being which has the potential to be let's just refer to it as an embryo, right? They'll say a clump of cells. We take this little thing, this clump of cells, and we say, oh, that's not valuable. It's not a person. It's not a real person. But all the potential of that real person is there, and we destroy it. Which, what other thing in the world do we do that with? We don't do that with anything. We don't do that with iron. We don't do that with gold. We don't do that with any kind of cloth. We don't take cotton and say, this isn't clothing, and throw it in the fire and destroy it because it's not like a finished dress. We recognize the potential value of different things and we value them. We buy and sell them, and so we make them, and so on. But then when it comes to the human, we're going to pretend that potential has no value. And you see, that's the real problem in the thinking. So when you talk about growth like that, what's happening is the human person that was formed in potential in the beginning, over time is slowly becoming more and more perfectly human. That's what's actually happening. They're becoming what they really are. And so even that change, that's not the real them. That's why, for example, if you're a kid and you do stupid things and you make mistakes, it's not that big of a deal because you're in the process of becoming human. And the things that you do that are wrong, it's not the real you. It's not the real person. It's part of the problem of change and becoming. It's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. You're becoming a real person. You're becoming a human being. And your childhood is a time where you go through change. It's temporary. There's all kinds of problems. Your body's changing. Your soul is developing. Before you're 7 or 8 years old, you don't even have reason developed yet in you. So if you think about it, the child is developing in potential. And then by the time you're 18 years old, our government, for example, says, you know what? You've probably reached a point in your development where you can be allowed to do big people things. You can be allowed to do human stuff. You can be allowed to drive a car. You can be allowed to vote. You can go get a job. You can start your own life. You can be free from your parents. By that time in your life, you're enough of a human to be trusted to do these things. And so the law gives you freedom that it doesn't give you when you're younger because you're just a caterpillar, right? You're not ready to fly like a butterfly yet. And then there's even more things. Like in the ancient world, they believed that people were still like kids until they were 25 years old. So even through the college ages, you were still considered like an adolescent. It was like you're still developing. You still don't know what you're doing yet. You're still learning. But when you were 25, that's when things started to change in the ancient world. If you look at our government, does anybody know how old you have to be a president? Anybody know how old you have to be the president of the United States? 30-ish? Yeah, 35 is actually the number. 35. So our government says you really don't know what you're doing yet. You really don't know, you really don't, you can't have the wisdom to be a leader until you're like 35 years old. And if you go into philosophy, usually philosophy says that around somewhere between 30 and 35, that's where the human person, assuming the person's doing the things they're supposed to be doing, you sort of come to perfection around in your mid 30s, which is interesting because that's when Jesus was crucified. So Jesus grew as a child, became a man, and was crucified. His life ended when he was at that point in his life where he had reached perfection. Like, what would the point be to have Jesus be 50 years old or 70 years old? Or there was no point. He reached his perfection, fulfilled his life's mission, and died. So in your 30s is usually when people are considered to be, fully developed and mature human beings. So if we're going to kill unborn children, we might as well be allowed to kill teenagers because they're also imperfect. We might as well be allowed to kill young children because they're also not really people. They can't drive. Is anybody really a human who can't drive? So you can see how dumb that reasoning is, but that's how we reason when we abort babies. We just say because it's not fully human, it's worthless, and therefore you can just get rid of it. But we don't do that with teenagers, and they're not fully human yet. They're still developing. We don't do that with elderly people. We don't take an old man who can't work anymore or who's starting to lose his mind or lose his memory. We don't say, he's not a human anymore. Let's get rid of Uncle Joe here. We don't treat people. I mean, there are people who would like to treat people like that, but we don't do that. So abortion is irrational, and it's contradicted by a million other things we do. So that's the idea of growth, George. You understand that? It's becoming perfect, becoming what you're to be. And then when you get older, you're actually, we say over the hill, right? You're over the hill because you come to that point in your life where you fulfill your life's purpose. And then you come to an older age where you start to slow down, you start to break down. Fortunately, if you're studying, you can actually continue growing in wisdom through your old age, but your body's going to break down. You can't do things anymore. Like I said last night, I'm up studying until 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm not going to be able to do that anymore when my body gets older. So right now in my life, I'm working at like full capacity, full potential, but that's going to slow down over time. And that's just how life works. All right. So good. We focus on the real things, and there's potential and actuality. You'll learn about this in philosophy if you study natural philosophy. You'll learn about potential and actuality. So when you're born, you're like all potential. When you come to that middle age period of your life, you're actualized. You're like actualizing your humanity, and then as you get older and start to decline, you're returning back into a state of potential, because you're losing some of that actuality. You're becoming less human in some ways as you get older. And then you die, and in the resurrection, everything is restored with even more perfect than before, and it abides forever. So it's more real. That's who you really are. The real you is the resurrected you, not the temporary you living in this world. Okay? So let's keep going here. To quote the words of Timaeus in Plato, Timaeus is a man in one of Plato's dialogues, a dialogue titled Timaeus. If you're ever interested in reading Plato, the Timaeus is where Plato teaches like his philosophy of the world, like the universe, how everything is organized and so on. That's in the Timaeus. To quote the words of Timaeus in Plato, no, I don't think, I'm not sure if the cave is in the Timaeus. I'm not sure. I'm not a big Plato fan. I don't spend a lot of time studying Plato. I'm an Aristotelian. In Plato we read, what is that? So Timaeus asks this question, what is that which always is? It's almost like a riddle. What is that which always is, which has no birth? And what is that which is always becoming, but never is? One of these is apprehended by the mental processes with reasoning and is ever the same. The other can be guessed at by opinion in company with unreasoning senses, a thing which becomes and passes away, but never really is. So that's the difference between the two kinds of things that exist. Now, they're both important, right? Physical things are important, but a wise person understands that the constantly changing things are just not the things you're really supposed to focus your mind on. They come and go. They're not that important. The things that abide and stay, they're the important things. Therefore, Nicomachus says, if we desire the goal that is actually worthy and fitting for man, a goal that's worthy for man, namely happiness of life, that's what we were created for. Dogs weren't created to be happy. Trees weren't created to be happy. Human beings were created to be happy. We're capable of thinking about happiness. We can understand the idea of happiness. We can talk about happiness. Dogs don't do that. They may look happy, but it's just because they get a treat or something and they wag their tail. And then we take human thoughts and we like pass them on to the dog and imagine that the dog is thinking like, oh, wow, I'm so happy. I'm so happy. The dog's not thinking that. The dog's saying, this is yummy, right? This treat is really good. This, having my back scratched feels good. That's all the dog's thinking. The dog's not thinking about happiness. But happiness of life is a worthy and fitting goal for human beings. And this is accomplished by philosophy alone and nothing else. Philosophy means for us the desire for wisdom, and wisdom is the science of truth in things. And of things, some are properly called things, but others merely share the name. It is reasonable and most necessary to distinguish and systematize the accidental qualities of things. Things, then, both those properly so-called real things and those that simply have the name of things. Some of them are unified and continuous. For example, an animal. An animal is unified and continuous. It's one thing. The universe is one thing. A tree is one thing, and the like. And these are properly and peculiarly called magnitudes. So now we're starting to get into mathematics. The first kind of thing, the first kind of real thing, things that we can call one thing, they're called magnitudes. That's the first kind of thing. Others are discontinuous in a side-by-side arrangement, and as it were in heaps or collections. These are called multitudes. So, for example, a flock of sheep is a multitude. A people, like a community of people, is called a people. Even though that's a singular noun, it represents a multitude of people. Even though a flock is a singular noun, it names a multitude of individuals. A heap of things, a chorus, again, a singular name, but it refers to a multitude of individuals, and so on. So what Pythagoras says is that there are two kinds of real things. All real things can be put into two different classes. They're either magnitudes if they're one and continuous, or they're multitudes if they're discontinuous or side by side, like a pile of coins. Two kinds of things, magnitudes and multitudes. And these things are mathematical things. Magnitudes and multitudes are mathematical. And this is why Pythagoras says philosophy begins with mathematics, because if we think about real things and how we can organize them, we can organize them in some way by number or by size, by magnitude or multitude. So he says, wisdom then must be considered to be the knowledge of these two forms. The knowledge of these two things must be wisdom, magnitude and multitude. Since, however, all multitude and magnitude are by their own nature infinite, what he means by this is there are an infinite number of different magnitudes. There are an infinite number of different multitudes. So multitude and magnitude are just two things, but there are an infinite number of multitudes and magnitudes. And when he says infinite, don't get a crazy idea like he means that they can never ever be numbered, like even God cannot number them. He doesn't mean infinite in that way. He simply means infinite in that you can't number them, right? Like the sand on the seashore for you and for me is infinite. You can't number the sand on the seashore. The stars of heaven, for you and for me, they're infinite. They're not infinite for God, but for you and me, they might as well be infinite. We can't number them. We can't number the grains of sand on the seashore. So we can call it infinite relative to us, even though it's not infinite to God. George, question from George, he says, so wisdom is gained from studying real things, but philosophy is about eternal things. Well, George, real things and eternal things are the same, but the problem is even when we talk about eternal things, Christians are usually talking about physical things. We're talking about physical things that last forever. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that are eternal, that they will never end. They never change. So if the thing that you're thinking about changes and dies, that's not the real thing. And that's how you have to challenge yourself to ask, what then is the real thing? Like when Pontius Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth, right? Pontius Pilate is a carnal man living there, making decisions, influenced by the crowd. He's got Christ in front of him and this wild, stupid mob, and he's listening to the mob and asking what is truth. You see, the problem with Pontius Pilate is he was not philosophical, right? If he was, he would have made a better decision. So even though we've got multitude and magnitude, it's just two things, just two kinds of things. The number of different magnitudes and the number of different multitudes is infinite. So we can't study those things. We can't learn about human beings by studying human beings, because there's a relatively infinite number of human beings. What am I going to do? Am I going to go interview and study every single human being to try to understand human beings? No. But it doesn't make sense to, because you don't need to do that. Because with reason, you can understand what's really true about human beings by simply reflecting on what human beings are, not by going and studying every single human being. If I want to understand what a frog is, do I need to go and study every single frog? No, I don't need to study the frogs. I need to think about what a frog is and focus on its essence. That's philosophy, okay? So we can't think about this infinite number of magnitudes and multitudes. We can't do that. Sciences, he says, and I'm just going to try to finish this up here. Sciences are always sciences of limited things, never of infinite things. So when modern scientists say, we're going to figure this out by studying, real science is not a study of things that are infinite in number. That's how we can tell that many scientists are foolish, because the idea that you're going to learn the truth by studying individual people or individual bugs or individual stars, that's not wisdom. You're never going to finish that study, and anything you say about all of those things is going to be unproven. So that's not real science. It's evident that a science dealing with magnitude per se, that means in and of itself, or with multitude per se, could never be formulated, for each of them is limitless in itself. Multitude in the direction of just increasing more and more, and magnitude in the direction of the less, because we can just keep dividing things into more and more parts. A science would arise to deal with something separated from each of them, with quantity, which is set off from multitude, and size, which is set off from magnitude. So we cannot study multitudes, we cannot study magnitudes by themselves, because they're infinite. Multitude can be multiplied infinitely, magnitude can be divided infinitely. And so for multitude, what we focus on is quantity. And for magnitude, what we focus on is size. So quantity and size are the actual objects of the science of mathematics, quantity and size. In the next chapter, we're going to divide that even further and get into all four of the mathematical sciences. But what's to draw out of chapter 2 is that the focus of mathematics, even though we talk about magnitude and multitude, the focus of mathematical studies, the focus of philosophy in mathematical things is on quantity and on size. That's what we're going to be studying. And we'll talk about that more next week. But that's chapter 2 in Nicomachus. We're going to continue to study this. So if some of this is confusing, we're going to continue to move forward studying, and we're going to also continue to go back and review, and we'll move forward and review what we've studied. We'll do both things as we go on. So don't get stressed if any of this is confusing the first time you hear it. We're going to continue talking through these things while we learn more and more as we go on. All right. So that's all for chapter 2. If you haven't studied this yet, I want you to go read it for yourself. And even if you have studied it, reread it now that we discuss it and are talking about it and thinking about it more. Reread it, because you'll notice details in the readings that you missed the first time, and some of them can be important. So if you haven't studied it, read it and complete the assignments and get these lessons done. If you have already read it and studied it, go back and reread it and see if there's something in there you can find that you missed the first time, because I'm sure there is. So anyway, that's all for today. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to turn off the recording now, and then if there's any questions, we can answer those questions, but that's all for today. All right.